Welcome to this episode of HCA Talks Health. I'm your host, Zina LaRue, and today I'm talking to Elaine Wilkins. So, Elaine is a multi award winning pioneering founder of the Trauma Informed Wellbeing Coach, as well as the Chrysalis Effect, which is a provider of an online recovery focused pathway for those suffering with symptoms of fatigue related illness. And these include ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia. So thank you very much for joining us today, Elaine. I'm very curious about your work and excited to share it with our audience.
Oh, thank you, Zena. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the work you are doing is extremely important and it's very relevant, not only because it's helping a lot of people across the globe, but also because this has been a very personal journey for you. And I'd love for you to tell us more about this a bit later, but I think perhaps we should start with just some clarification around what ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia is, and what types of symptoms people can expect when they're dealing with these conditions.
Yes, certainly. So ME is the abbreviation for myalgic encephalomyelitis. So you can see why it's abbreviated.
Yes.
And chronic fatigue syndrome is often abbreviated to CFS. Other sort of terminology is used as well, and fibromyalgia. And what they tend to have in common are symptoms that affect every system of the body. So that would be cognitive symptoms. So being struggling with memory. People describe it as brain fog. I know when I was ill, it felt like my head was filled with kind of hot cotton wool. So thinking and cognitive executive function processes are really badly affected, and that can be something that probably causes the most concern and stress in people. Then we're looking at obviously energy problems. So, severe, unrelenting exhaustion. And the gut issues are normally people will struggle with various compromised gut. So whether that's food intolerances, irritable bowel syndrome, and there will be bloating and all kinds of issues. So reacting to things like alcohol, reacting quite dramatically to caffeine, not being able to tolerate those things. And then, of course, there is various pain. So for many people in the chronic fatigue arena, it tends to be headaches, a lot of headaches, and that is often will then accelerate into migraines and quite sort of severe migraines and headaches. There will be a lot of unexplained pain. That could be muscle and joint pain. And then there are there's the kind of emotional side where there's often a lot of anxiety. You've got all these symptoms going on and that you can't understand why, and is so sort of multifaceted. Then there's often a lot of as I say, anxiety issues. And, when you don't get answers and you're left unwell for quite a long period of time, then that will often deteriorate into sort of depression. And they're all kind of really, really common. In terms of ME and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, they're all kind of the commonalities. When you start to look at fibromyalgia, there tends to be much more pain. So people will be describing their pain as sort of burning, searing, excruciating. They use words like that. And in extreme cases, people literally cannot bear to be touched. So, I've had cases where people haven't been able to hug their children, because the pain is just too acute. Yeah. So the fibromyalgia is diagnosed more easily because there are these 18 tender points on the body. So when somebody sees a consultant, if they then examine that person and there is at least 11, they're reacting to 11, then they will probably get a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. So it tends to be more sort of acute pain and more diagnosed pain areas, fibromyalgia diagnosis. The other ME and chronic fatigue, it tends to be much more around the level of post-exertional malaise, exhaustion, and also inability to deal with light and noise. What happens is that the body gets into what we call sympathetic dominance, where they're unable to filter out light and noise. So that's often why people feel the need to really isolate. So it's a very isolating illnesses, really.
Yes, and I can imagine that in some cases people don't necessarily know that it's a disease or it's an illness. They might just be thinking that, oh, I'm just tired or something's wrong, but we can't necessarily pinpoint it. So I can imagine that it might be frustrating for some, especially in the beginning stages.
Yeah, exactly. And what we find, and I was the same. I thought I suddenly got ill, because there is a tipping point for, most people, what they'll find is that something will come along and tip them over, almost like a final straw moment. So, most recently that would be a virus like, COVID. And that could be swine flu, it could be Epstein-Barr virus. There's lots of viral tipping points, as well as stressors that can just be that final straw for someone, whether that's a bereavement, whether that's a relationship breakup, whether that is losing a job or being in a really highly stressful job. There are going to be accumulative stressors, and then something will come along that will just be that final tipping point. But you don't often realize that. And then it's only retrospectively, when you start to work on your recovery, you start to look back at maybe just how many, on a timeline, how many sort of things you've been carrying. And of course, underlying all of that, the one that people are least aware of is that there will be adverse childhood experiences and some unprocessed grief or trauma in there. So, the body does definitely keep the score, and it is holding a lot usually. And what we also know about ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia, and the people that sort of succumb to an illness, we know that with certain adverse childhood experiences and early traumas, small t traumas as they're known, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that, but they would be something like 600% more likely at some point in adulthood to develop chronic exhaustive illness. So there is a sort of certainty to it with we call it ACE scores, when people have got a certain number of ACE scores. And of course, myself and most people have absolutely no way of linking this current illness in their adult life to what may have happened many decades ago.
Yes. No, I can imagine that if you're thinking physical pain, migraines, gut issues, that most people would think, oh, it's maybe nutrition, maybe physiological issues, but not many people would make that link back to adverse childhood experiences, unresolved trauma, unprocessed grief.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, that this is really like 600, it could increase your chances by 600%. If you had to deal with these types of things in childhood. So how do you define an adverse childhood experience or trauma? Because I think also many people, when they hear the word trauma, they think, it must have been a huge form of abuse or neglect or something down that line. Does it have to be that extreme, or how do you define trauma?
No, it doesn't. But the basis of how we can kind of get a handle on where people's trauma is starting off with ACE scores. So Dr. Vincent Felitti was running an obesity trial sort of decades ago, and he was having fantastic success. People were wanting to lose weight, and these were kind of obese patients that he was supporting through a program to lose weight. And they did really, really well, lost many, many stones in weight. And then, to his kind of disappointment, started piling the weight back on. And it was so frustrating because they'd been so happy to lose that weight. So he started reaching out and just calling them and seeing, what was going on. And by chance, somebody just shared that they'd experienced some abuse in their childhood. And that led him to start asking some questions to the other people he was calling. Anyway, that was the kind of the early stages of it. And he started to realize that there was this correlation between regaining the weight and trauma. And he then teamed up with Dr. Robert Anders, and they did the Kaiser Permanente study. So it was 17,000 people were put through the study, and it has literally changed the face of how we view illness and disease, because what they could then plot was the correlations between the level of diversity that a child was exposed to and the illnesses that they're going to develop in adulthood. And so we are talking cancers, stroke, heart disease, all the kind of major ones. And as part of that ongoing and corroborating trials and studies that they've done, they've seen that that's also it's got a very strong link to addiction development in people, people using something to cope with the challenges that they've experienced in their lives, a sort of a coping mechanism that they will have adopted to feel better about themselves. So yeah, the original trial divided the adverse childhood experiences into sort of emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and it's, and also then household dysfunction. So if a child was growing up in a difficult circumstance, because as children we're powerless, aren't we? It's a lottery who we're born to, and the things that we're exposed to. So that can be if somebody in your home has had a mental illness and couldn't kind of emotionally attach correctly, so there wasn't sort of bonding or whatever at birth, maybe a very stressed mother. Maybe there was a substance abuse going on in the home and a lot of chaos. Maybe a parent went away, there was a divorce. So all of these things have an impact, and they're seen as a score on the kind of ACE scoring. And what we know is that right from in the womb, the stress levels and the cortisol that would have been circulating in the mother's blood is all starting to landscape that child's neurology. So when a child is born and they're born into a situation where there are those challenges and difficulties, and often when they don't get what they need, it's not necessarily physical harm or abuse in the way that we would think, but if that child is sensitive, for instance, and this is what we see in a lot of the profiles of people that end up with ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. They tend to have a highly sensitive predisposition, and we know the genetics around that now. It's about 20% of the population are, we call it sensory processing sensitivity, actually. But the work of Elaine, highly sensitive persons, then we can have that predisposition, but we're born into an environment that's nurturing, and we've got great bonding, and we get the emotional support and the love and that confidence building that we need as children. If we get all of that, then the genes don't switch on that lead to those sort of longer term illnesses. If we don't get our needs met, and if we are in a highly stressful environment, then of course we know with epigenetics, it's the genes get switched on depending on the environment that we're growing in. So it's been compared to dandelions and orchids. So people that tend to develop ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, they tend to fall under the orchid camp. If you've ever tried to grow, dandelions grow everywhere and anywhere, on a bomb site. But if you try to grow an orchid and it isn't got exactly the right soil, exactly the right temperature, and that sort of nurturing, it needs a lot more care, then it will thrive and it will blossom. So it's all of this thing, being able to bring this understanding and learning. My goodness, I wished I'd known it when I was ill, because I had no concept.
Yeah, of course. So it seems like the trauma is directly impacting our bodies as well. So it's not just about the fact that those types of profiles of those types of people would use more harmful coping mechanisms, and that's what causing them to become ill, right? It's actually the trauma that's impacting, like you're saying, with epigenetics, certain genes that are turned on or off, more cortisol in the body, that's actually causing many of these symptoms.
Exactly.
And I know that like Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk has done important work in this area on how trauma is impacting our bodies. The body remembers, right?
Body remembers. And recovery really, when we first started 15 years ago, supporting people with recovery, we were supporting people in these 8 key areas, biopsychosocial approach, because the acute disease model, the reason people get stuck believing that they can't recover is when they go to their GP and they have the blood tests and everything. Very, very difficult to get an actual test that defines ME or chronic fatigue. And so therefore, they tend to have all these symptoms. And so we know that the acute disease model tends to, treat the symptoms rather than address the root cause.
Mm-hmm.
And so, certainly in my experience, I was offered antidepressants 6 times. I was offered sleeping medication, because insomnia is one of the symptoms I didn't mention. Sleep issues is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And pain medication for the pain. So, I just had this real conviction in me. I think the teacher in me, I've always been in education and training. I've always so curious. I always want to know why.
Yeah.
So I just thought, if that's just going to be a sticking plaster, if I can actually find out why my body has just, gone haywire, because it felt like, I think it's been described as internal global warming by Patrick Holford. If I could just understand why everything was going wrong and address those things, I knew that the symptoms would, fall away. I just had that absolute conviction. And that's what we see. What I didn't have awareness of at that early stage was anything around trauma. And so, I think one of my greatest sort of pleasures really is actually being able to see the light bulbs when people start to piece it all together and can relate and recognize that sensitivity in themselves. The type of profile that I was talking about in terms of sensitivity tends to be someone who is highly empathic, and really sort of is someone that feels things very deeply. And therefore, if we've had very difficult emotions and experiences in our past, then we tend to find that quite hard to process. And so the coping mechanisms often that people use is that they make themselves busy, and that was certainly in my history. I was very driven, very always sort of going the extra mile for people, very much a people pleaser, and we know that this all again links back to, if you have got a difficult childhood, you become hypervigilant. You are watching, you are looking for people's reactions in their faces. If you're not sure whether a parent is going to be in a good mood or a bad mood and how that's going to affect you, then you literally are in this hypervigilant state. And this then means that children learn that they'll choose attachment over authenticity. So when someone disapproves when you're a child, or makes you feel that somehow you're wrong, or takes away your confidence, or doesn't give you the sort of support or encouragement in the things that you're interested in, then what happens is you start to try and kind of bend yourself out of shape to please that person. So what we see are masking behaviors starting very early on in life, where children will do anything to get that approval. So they often will become people pleasers, or try and prove themselves, or become quite high achievers. And so in the background of a lot of people that end up with ME, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, there's a lot of pushing themselves really hard, a lot of self-criticism, and so I think one of the things that I always say to any health professional is, you really have to know your client. And that's one of the reasons why we were so keen to make sure that people had this trauma informed education, and not just about, you know, what trauma is and how to describe it and explain it, but know how it affects your client from childhood up, so that you know who you're dealing with and what they respond really well to. And so the great news is, this all sounds awful, doesn't it? That, you know, if you're highly sensitive and you've had a difficult start in life, you may have, you know, there's a score of 10 that the ACE scores are based on. I've got an ACE score of 8, which actually, if I hadn't have intercepted and changed my environment and learned self-care and self-love, and, you know, and given myself the things that I need to be able to be authentically me, then I would have gone on to develop one of those more serious diseases. And I always say to people with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, because your body is so finely tuned, it's giving you messages all the time, but society and conditioning means we override them. So, you know, as all health coaches will know, you know, people come along, they're carrying limiting beliefs, they're telling themselves that they can't make changes, even though their body's screaming at them to make the changes. And so there is what we call in those illnesses, there's 6 phases of the recovery process. Phase 1 is the one where we're totally unaware. It's the denial phase, and it's where we would be self-medicating for the migraines and the IBS and the you know, and not being able to sleep. So for me, that would have been, you know, just taking Gaviscon when my stomach was upset, or going to the doctors and getting something for the IBS, you know, for years. And I started with the IBS at 14, and nobody back then, and I don't know that they even do now, asked me what was going on in my life. So it was just medicated, you know. So when I tipped over into chronic fatigue in my 40s, I'd had an incredible history, really, when I think back of having lots of water infections and, you know, various sort of gynecological things, and sort of medications and pessaries and antibiotics, you know, so a whole history of taking these things to medicate symptoms instead of actually looking at what's going on in our lives. And that is where the healthcare model now, thankfully, is starting to change. We're starting, you know, if we can look at the biology, what's going on biologically for people, what's going on psychologically for people, and what's going on socially for people, the biopsychosocial approach. And so that's what we've developed in the Chrysalis Effect, so that people have a phenomenal understanding of what's led up to their illness, what their tipping points are, what their personal profile is, you know, what makes us tick, what has made us perhaps negate our own needs and our own feelings in order to survive, you know, in its survival. People have lived for a long time, they've had difficult start in life in survival mode, and the body has got a certain point where it will reach capacity, and it's trying to give you warnings that something isn't right in various areas of your life. And that can be your nutrition. I was a fast foodie, you know, when I was rushing around being all things to all people, businesswoman, you know, teenage kids, all of that, and burning the candle at both ends. You know, my body was really, really the last thing I considered important. You know, I didn't know how to self-care. So nutrition, thyroid and adrenals is central to recovery in these illnesses as well. They get impacted because of the stress response in the body, that heightened stress response. We have to learn what our triggers are, what are the things that cause that domino effect in the body. I think that's one of the most important parts of our recovery pathways, when we explain to people what the symptoms are and why each area of the body is affected. So for instance, you know, the adrenal fight and flight response, you talked about Peter Levine's Awaken the Tiger. His first book was just such an eye-opener, that, you know, when people start to release trauma, it can be a physical experience. You know, you can feel the movement in the body. Use things like EFT, EMDR, to shift that energy. So the adrenals get absolutely exhausted because they're in perpetual motion, and the parasympathetic nervous system can't come in anymore. When you're constantly under stress, cumulative stress, and then the stress of illness that you can't understand. So people literally come to us, my body used to feel like it was jangling inside, and I thought I had some terrible undiagnosed neurological condition, but it was just, your body literally at breaking point with the amount of stress that you've been dealing with.
Yeah.
So, nutrition, thyroid and adrenals, we have to address those. We have to address the emotional health. We have to address lifestyle and pace, which has usually got completely out of whack. And if people aren't very driven in terms of career or pushing themselves really hard in sport or the gym or whatever, pushing themselves beyond, they're often doing it in over-giving behaviours, putting themselves at the bottom of the pile. So we have a lot of people that, will admit to the fact that everyone else's needs has come first throughout their life. And it all goes back to, why would that happen? Because babies aren't like that. Babies are born, they're really kind of like, here I am, world, and they will cry when they want something, and they will really let everyone know that they've got needs.
Yeah.
And we learn to negate our needs to fit in, to please others, to get the approval of parents. So environment, as I said, sensitive people can't stand noisy environments. You'll often find that they'll be working in open plan offices with bright lights and, perhaps a really difficult corporate structure they're trying to, fit into. And that isn't great either, and will have an impact on their ability to cope. Often feeling you've got to be very extrovert to do well, when perhaps what we need is solitude. And that's what I learned through recovery, was that I have a big need for solitude. And then life purpose. How many of us have done jobs that we did because we felt we had to, or we trained for it, and even though we hated it, we still kept going in and doing it? And then of course all of those things affect our relationships. The way we bonded with our parents will affect every relationship that we have. We'll get triggered by people, we'll be needy. And then movement, we all need movement, healthy movement. Some people take it to the extreme. They get their endorphins through, I've had clients that have done 70-hour weeks, then gone to they go to the gym after they finish.
Yeah. Wow.
And, do a really strong workout, and their body's crying out for rest, but get to the point where they can't rest anymore. And that's where I was, tired, but wired, laying in bed awake all night, but the brain racing. So, completely out of balance. And then almost going into this cell danger response where you can't move, and it's shocking when you've been somebody that's been a doer and a giver, and you've been out there, and then you wake up one day and you cannot put your foot to the floor and get out of bed.
But I find it quite interesting where, your body is instinctively trying to help you, right? It's wanting you to slow down. It's like, please hear me. Something's not right. You need to change something. Yeah. And if that is the method that it has to use to get your attention, I know it might be a bit harsh to say it in that way, but there's a reason why your body is acting in the way that it is.
Yeah. And it starts off whispering, and then if you just self-medicate or ignore it or push through. I can remember a time when I would be on the computer and I would start to feel really sick and start to get a headache, but the driven person in me, was, I'll just finish this. I'll just do this one more thing. What happened to me was that I became really a workaholic, and I didn't know that had happened to me. It's something that happens gradually, I just, and I was working for a cosmetic company. It was an international company, and it was all about being upbeat and positive and out there. And it was all, any sort of explaining if something wasn't working for you felt like it was negative. So I was traveling really long hours. I was having to be this upbeat person all the time. And it was all about targets and deadlines and things, which doesn't fit very well with me as a sensitive person. But I felt like I was literally being chased by a tiger every single month to meet these deadlines and things. And everyone else around me was doing the same thing. So you kind of become a bit like the people around you. So I'd gone from a previous career where I worked from home, I was there for my children, and I had a really balanced life. So I was still carrying all my trauma and everything, but my life was kind of okay. And although I would always be juggling lots of things and spinning lots of plates, because I didn't want to spend just time with me, with my emotions. I'd had a divorce, I'd lost my first son, I'd gone back to work 3 weeks after I'd lost that baby. There is this inability to process deep hurt, because we feel things so deeply. Empathic, highly sensitive people, often very creative though, and very intuitive. So there's a really big upside to being a sensitive person. So I think recovery is helping people to see what they haven't allowed themselves to process and get support in, releasing and sort of releasing and resolving the trapped emotion in the body, getting rid of that. Looking at their whole, what works in their life, what doesn't work in their life. When are they saying yes when they should be saying no? What type of relationships, perhaps difficult, challenging, even toxic relationships, need to be eliminated? Often there's a history of very difficult family life in there, and people are still trying to be part of these very, very dysfunctional families and always being made to feel wrong and different. So, the recovery pathway that we have is 9 months. And I always say it takes 9 months to, make a new life, whether that's a new baby or whatever. And it takes time for people to face up to their past, their present, and then be supported to create a future that is going to support them, their physiology, their preferences, what keeps them well. And that's a process to learn that. We have to let go of a lot of our old behaviors, our old conditioned beliefs. We certainly have to revisit our values. I think overgiving and not overgiving when I grew up. Working really hard, work ethic was something I grew up in. You worked your way through everything. And if you wanted to do anything for yourself, you were selfish. So, I had to really revisit all of that. And this is what we teach people to do. So the coaching underpins all of that to help people get the awareness, they get clarity of where they are and what's led them to that point. They get awareness of their obstacles and what's getting in the way of them being well. And then once they, I believe, got those things, that information, understanding the domino effect, understanding the iceberg, your symptoms are up here and below the surface is all what has caused you to override your body's messages and not listen. And you can't listen if you've never known how to care for yourself and how to, what foods you need, how much rest you need as a person, when you should say no instead of saying yes, then it's okay to do those things. Unless you've got all of that in place, then what happens is when people start to feel better, they just go back to doing exactly the same things again. I spent the first 2 years of my illness just trying to get back to work, to put myself under that horrendous stress again. It was only when I had a real epiphany that I just knew, for the first time in my life, I think since I started work as a Saturday girl. I don't even think it's illegal. It's legal now, but I was 12 when I started work and 14 when I was in full-time work. And all I'd ever known was work, and that defined me. So when I was and this is what you find with people, is when they're stopped in their tracks and they cannot do the things that they've always done, then there is an identity crisis. And that's why we call it the Chrysalis Effect, because you go into that really dark place where you've got to kind of let go of everything you knew and allow yourself to become who you always were supposed to be.
That's
And
beautiful.
watching people discover that, watching them discover that they need solitude, that they need to be in nature, that, I mean, when people are really poorly and they've been bedbound for a long while, we say, get wrapped up in a blanket and get out in that garden in the sunshine. Nature heals. So, but being what we find works, so what I call it role model medicine. In the Chrysalis Effect, we've got so many people that are fully recovered from all of those illnesses, plus more recently over the last few years. We've always worked with post-viral fatigue because it's all similar. But when we saw the people coming through with long COVID, and we got the first NHS pilot with long COVID patients, there's kind of 4 subtypes in there, and some of them we can't work with. They are sadly the people that have perhaps had such a lot of physical damage done through intubation and all that, and they've ended up with all kinds of blood clots in their lungs and all those kinds of things. So we're very careful on the subtypes of the ones that we really can help with. But what we find with those people when we look at the health profile is there's no difference on the health profile from the ME and the chronic fatigue and the fibromyalgia. And when we start to delve, there is the adverse childhood experiences, there's all the small t traumas, there's a high level of sensitivity, there's usually the high stress life events and lifestyle and pace, and the not being able to give themselves what they need. But lots and lots of people in the health service end up with chronic fatigue syndrome because they're givers, and they've never put themselves first. So what we see is similarities. There might be a few additional things, maybe some shortness of breath on exertion, they may be left with some of that, but we're very careful who we can help. And they absolutely thrive and take off when they realize that COVID was just that tipping point. We think about a container ship with containers on it. If you keep piling and piling them up, all those stresses, eventually that ship's going to tip over, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. No, but I love how you are supporting people through a 9-month process. I think that's so important because that's, even as coaches, we see that if we don't support the client for long enough, then they could tend to fall back into old habits. So really making the changes their new normal and having that community to support them and set up, like you said, a new future for them. It's not just about working through the past, it's not just dealing with the present, but it's also setting up a future for myself where I don't have to lose myself anymore. I can be myself in an authentic way. I'm not going to keep on people pleasing and that same pattern that you want to repeat from your childhood, where I would prefer connection instead of authenticity, right? So we're trying to break that cycle for clients, and it takes time. Of course, it takes a lot of time. So I think that's really great that you are supporting people over a longer process of time. But just coming back to the Trauma Informed Wellbeing Coach, I think this is so important because you also provide training to coaches, right?
Yeah, we do.
And I think with all of this said, we can't ignore trauma when we're working with clients. We need to take this into consideration. We need to be sensitive to trauma, especially when we're working with chronic conditions and pain. Like you said, it's usually part of where they are at today is the trauma. So how do you help professionals to deal with this? Or is it just about becoming sensitive to trauma and how to bring up the subject of trauma? Or is it also about, I guess, not treating trauma directly, but what do you teach coaches?
Yeah, so originally we our wellbeing coaching program, which sort of underpins the way we support people through ME, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, had an additional element to it, which is recovery specialists. So it's for people that really want to niche and work with recovery and being able to have all that understanding of the things that we've spoken about. Because I don't know about you, Zena, but when I trained as a coach many years ago. And at the time when I trained, I was told that actually giving any kind of input or advice was the last resort of a poor coach. So it was all about asking powerful questions. And well, I was told that clients have all the answers within them. Well, I found in reality that wasn't the case. And then I went through and having gone through my chronic fatigue journey, what I knew was that I didn't know what I didn't know. And it was imperative that when I started putting together the accredited training and coaching training for our people that were going to work with these patients and clients, was that they needed to have in their structure of coaching, there needed to be room for mentoring and also explaining things and being able to teach. So the model that I put together was very much coaching, 80% coaching, because pure coaching is fantastic, but the other 20% had to be a combination of mentoring and teaching, where we can show someone what they don't know. And of course, what fitted under that umbrella was opening up that conversation around trauma. And so many people were really nervous of it. They were frightened once they started to learn about how people can be triggered. But of course, we've all got a past ourselves, haven't we, as coaches? And we can be triggered. And we need to know what's gone on for us. Because, you know, sometimes there's that break in rapport with a client and you don't know what you've done, or you feel kind of affected. So we used to originally do the wellbeing coaching, then the recovery specialist work, and then we had a CPD option, which was around learning about trauma. And that was fantastic training. It was really understanding how the brain is landscaped for hypervigilance from pre-birth and all of that. And it was all the sort of academic learning. But what I'm a practical person, and what I felt coaches were nervous of, and what they were telling me, they were frightened of opening up the conversation, or frightened of triggering someone, or having someone get triggered. What would they do? How would they deal with it? And the thing as well for me was, when you think of the number of coaches out in the world doing all this amazing work, how can you sit with somebody one-on-one and have all this knowledge that unprocessed trauma can lead to long-term health conditions and things like that, and not bring that into that client's awareness? It's absolutely imperative. It's been called, the sort of rule of everything now. It underpins everything we do if we're working in health. So what I put together was this accredited training that helps coaches to understand small t trauma and understand all the ACE scoring, and gives them all the resources to use with clients, and also to give them scripts of how to introduce the trauma topic. Because when people are in phase one, that denial phase, like we witness with, I think we helped just under 5,000 people now through their recovery. They're not going to have any awareness, and what I see is that light bulb for them is huge. But then what? If they know they've got all this trauma and they know how it's impacting them, then what? So having scripts to be able to open up the conversation, having resources for your clients to actually look at, and and for you to have that awareness, but to be able to introduce that tool at the right time for that person. And then the other thing is knowing the modalities that are out there that you're going to need to cross-refer to. I've been working in this field now for decades, but I am not a trauma release expert. I can explain it. I can teach it. I can support people to have those light bulb moments, but then I want them to be able to walk across the bridge, have someone hold their hand to take them into the right thing. So as part of that training, we explore all the modalities that are out there. So, and there's no one size fits all for modalities, are there? So the other thing that clients will often say is, oh, I've had counselling. And it either made them, it was helpful to them, but they're still carrying their trauma. And the reason they're still carrying their trauma is because it hasn't been somatically released. It has to be released via the body, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's where it's stuck, and that's why they're getting pain and symptoms and things. So I think the thing that coaches that come through this training, it's quite a short course, but they just can leave there knowing that they can open the conversation, they understand what enmeshment is, they can explain it, they understand what scapegoating is, they can explain it, they can recognize the attachment styles, they can explain that to the client. I'm a great believer it's not about us being an expert, it's about us walking side by side with our client, and we walk that path with them. And when they have that knowledge and they become as knowledgeable as we do, then they become really, I don't like the word compliant, but you know what I mean, that it's a collaboration, and they're excited to learn the next piece, and it opens up the whole world for them. So when they understand their attachment, they're going to have a lot of pain coming with that. You know, if you are working with someone who actually it's going to be better for them to step away from dysfunctional family relationships, I've had to do that for my own save myself. There's a grief attached to that. So also understanding about grief and processing and having those tools to use with clients is super important. Knowing all the different modalities, everything from equine therapy through to logosynthesis, EMDR, all these different modalities. What are they? How do they work? So that you can explain that to your client so that they will know what feels kind of right for them. And the other thing that we do, because we've built the recovery pathway and the community of recoverers and the community of recovery specialists and practitioners with all the different modalities, when people do the training, it's not just about, oh, well, I know what that modality is. They're actually plugged into the experts in those fields. So they can refer and they can recommend to a client to have, a consult, a sort of exploratory consult with someone to see whether that is going to be a good modality for them. So I'm working with clients all the time where I get a sense of what modality they probably will feel more comfortable around, and I can make some introductions and some suggestions so that they then own that decision, because I've seen the damage of people just going and choosing a practitioner to release their trauma, and it has been the worst thing. It
could be re-traumatizing in some cases, even
re-traumatizing, and often a lot of talking therapies will re-traumatize, and so we've got to be aware of that, because coaching is a talking therapy in effect. So I think having the knowledge that every client that comes to you need to be able to check for trauma where that fits in, and we do that via various things, and that we include that into the training so that you have the what to do and what to say. And I think that and then who, it's sort of what to do, what to say, and who can support us as the team to support that person through the next part of their healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the most important part here is that it should be a body-based therapy in order for the trauma to be released. It's really not just about talking about your trauma over and over again. That's not necessarily gonna help you in the way that it could.
And that's why we bring, as part of our recovery community, recovery pathway, we kind of have encompassed every area. And so we've got our yoga teacher, we have got a yoga hub in our recovery pathway, and that's somebody who's had fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, who's recovered. I'm a great believer in, you've got to have role models, and but trauma informed. So being able to do somatic yoga. I was at a workshop I went to a retreat on Saturday and did somatic yoga, and there are, because you don't just release all your trauma in one go. It's a layered effect. It's like an onion, isn't it? So people will do a certain amount of work, and then they'll plateau for a while and be fine, and then something else will, the body will allow that then to come up and work with, and certainly in grief, and having really good grief recovery experts as well in the coaching team. And we're very lucky we've got that too. And we've also got people that deal with, the sexual abuse side or the domestic violence side, so I think to be a great coach, you need to be in part of a great team.
Absolutely.
I know that I don't have to have it all, know it all, but I do need to know what's available and how to help that person get what they need. I think taking the ego out of coaching and thinking we can do a certain amount with someone, but we're probably, we always work on a cross-referral methodology with all of our people so that they get what they need when they need it.
Yeah. Thank you, Elaine, for informing us on this very important topic, and for putting together this program that's really supporting people in such a comprehensive way. Just to end off, just the last question. So, what we often see is that as our health improves, or the health of our clients improves, that their horizons can expand as well. So much is possible for them. It's not just about recovery, but perhaps even sustained health and well-being. So what would your wish be for someone who went through your program?
Well, it's actually kind of a bit of a mantra, is that when people work through, we support them to go through those 6 phases of recovery. And when they get to phase 6, which is full recovery, they will always honor their well-being above all else. And that is my wish for every single one of them, because when they come in the door, they're not doing that. And when they, get those wings and start to fly, they will have their healthy snacks in their pocket or in their bag or in their car, wherever they go. They will, make sure they're hydrated. They'll make really healthy choices. They will be doing, they will be working in something or choose a new job. They'll often let go of those really stressful environments. They know that they can't function in them, so they will have often transitioned into new career. Something I'm really proud of is that we've got over 30 people that have come through recovery pathway and then wanted to help others. So we have a bursary program. And so we had people from all different walks of life that then realize, this journey was for me to actually get on point with my life purpose. And, and they are some of the most incredible recovery coaches, because they've been there, they've done it, they've experienced it, and the compassion, the understanding, and at the same time honoring their own values, being able to work more flexibly in an environment that suits them, all of those things, but it changes generations. When you honor your well-being above all else and you support your clients to do that, they are teaching their children. We've got amazing stories where that they've seen the difference in their families, their children, and we know that those children are going to go on to parent, and so cycles are broken. When
the
you honor
intergenerational trauma cycles,
it actually, we often say that, when someone highly sensitive goes through this experience, I truly believe that they are that person that's been chosen to break that cycle. And we say that to people a lot. And, I had a very dysfunctional family. There was a lot of addiction. There was a lot of love in the early days, but not being able to meet those emotional needs, traumatized parents, intergenerational, so much there. And knowing all this stuff is so empowering, because I have broken that cycle for my family, and supporting others to do the same. And it all comes from learning to honor your well-being above all else.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And thanks for helping us to understand how, an integrative approach is really key here. When it comes to these illnesses, there's not a one size fits all solution necessarily. And that the support really goes a long way. So where can audiences find you? Just the last question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So our website is the chrysaliseffect.co.uk. So I'm sure you'll be able to write that down. It's always tricky to spell that one.
Yeah, no,
Still
we'll
get
write
it
it
wrong
down.
after all these times. But yeah, and also email if people are looking for information around the Trauma Informed Wellbeing Coach. It's 5 modules, and really nice sort of short course that's going to give you such phenomenal insights for working with your clients. So the email for that is team@chrysaliseffecthealth.com. So I'll make sure that you've got that, Zena.
Thank you.
So
Yep.
that, we look forward to supporting coaches in being able to bring this really powerful message to their clients and transform their life and health.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for doing this very important work.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.